Hello, everybody. Welcoming you back to the Utopias podcast. I'm really happy to welcome today's guest, Kaiser Kuo. Kaiser is a man who wears many hats, Chinese-American journalist, podcaster, member or co-founder of a rock band called Tang Dynasty and Spring and Autumn, and a former manager in public communications at Baidu, which is one of China's biggest technology companies and its major search engine. This is a really great conversation co-hosted with our director of outreach for Utopias, Tulin Chang. And it's a fantastic conversation where we describe and look at what is occurring in China. What does the Chinese model of the future look like? Where has China gone in recent decades, coming out of incredible amounts of poverty, but also with an embrace of both certain forms of authoritarianism and capitalism? What can the West learn from China? And how have views around China changed over time? And really, where are we going into the future? And, as you all know, many visions and directions for technology as well are being driven by the Chinese government, different visions and ideas and strategies of how the world, the order of the world, a big question in these times. So I want to welcome you all to our latest episode of Utopias, co-hosted with Tulin. Kaiser Kuo here. Thank you all. Please enjoy. And as always, please rate, review, and subscribe and share this with everybody and anybody. We're a non-commercial labor of love.
Hi, everyone. As Ramesh already mentioned, I'm Tulin Chang Maltepe, and I'll be co-hosting this conversation with Kaiser. Beyond what Ramesh has already said, I really wanted to bring Kaiser onto Utopias to honor and discuss the work he's been doing with the Sinica Podcast and his other accompanying projects. I've been a longtime follower of his work, and I really believe he's been creating his own kind of form of utopia by bringing more light and less heat to what's going on the ground in China. It's rather brave and unique to establish Sinica as a long-standing forum for authentic insights that are not just about policy and politics, but also about language and culture and history. So I'm so grateful to have been in conversation with him, and I'm really excited for you guys to hear it. Enjoy. All right. Kaiser, we are so excited to have you join us on the Utopias podcast. Utopias usually isn't about China specifically, but it's about tech's role in supporting democracy and economic justice. We've hosted guests across the spectrum, economists, monks, musicians, politicians, and I think we really would be remiss not to look at the different frameworks of economic development and of ways of achieving economic justice that China has presented. So we're really looking forward to the conversation today. Yeah.
So great. So we'll be talking about tech's role in supporting authoritarianism and preventing economic justice, then, since we're bringing China into the conversation, right?
Critiquing things in certain ways, I would say, or looking at, China's role in shaping modernity is kind of the first thing I want to discuss.
Sure.
From your, I guess, Great Reckoning essay that I read that was published in the Ideas Letter, what the West should learn from China. I think one of the big themes that came out is what does modernity look like? China is you argue that China is shifting into this new position where they're no longer catching up with the West's definition of modernity, rather they're redefining it in some ways. So I'm wondering if you can talk to us a little bit about what you mean by that, and also what are some aspects of China's history and culture that we can look to for some insight into how China might handle its new position in the history of progress and modernity?
Sure. When I talk about modernity as being distinct in China from the Western template, what I really mean is it's not just sort of technological convergence or anything like that, or China having surpassed the United States arguably in some aspects of technology. It's just a completely different configuration of values, of institutions, of really priorities. In the Western post-Enlightenment story, the state is really something that is the object of restraint. It's to be restrained, and progress is driven by the dynamism of these individuals, of markets, of civil society, kind of in opposition to the state, right? Modernity is almost synonymous in the Western telling with emancipation from tradition, emancipation from hierarchy, from collective constraint. But I think in the Chinese story, it's a very, very different one. Indeed, the state is quite central. It's not merely a regulator or some kind of like a guarantor of order. It's actually, you could even say it's the active architect of national destiny. I use too big of a word. Modernity has been understood as liberation from authority, in the West, where in China it's more sort of a fulfillment of collective potential through cooperation, or at least in the ideal, that's what it's supposed to be. So very, very different root construct there. And I think that maybe gets to the essence of what it is, because we can look at a lot of other examples of modernity. I mean, some of the pushback on the essay has been, well, haven't we seen instances of non-Western modernity in the East Asian, developmental states? Well, yes, but in so many ways they sort of cribbed the Washington approach. This sort of thing that comes down to us from John Locke and Adam Smith, right? I think the difference with China is pretty pronounced. Mm. You asked about what historical examples we might look to. Well, I mean, China's story of modernity is quite a new one. I think it's very much more a matter of China having looked to Western examples, and now it's really because this is sort of the first time that we have seen a state emerge into modernity, hewing to a completely different path. There aren't going to be, I mean, almost by tautology, I mean, a lot of examples that we can then look to in China. And I certainly wouldn't argue. I mean, despite the title, which I didn't come up with, this business of learning from China, I certainly don't argue that it's the United States needs to copy models like this from China. I mean, I think just the opposite. I think that what I am really arguing here is that national conditions, national circumstances, the whole sort of cluster of values and beliefs and attitudes and habits of mind that the whole habitus of the Chinese, of each individual country, really kind of determines the right path to modernity. That I'm arguing against this idea that we can just sort of copy paste. Mm.
I really appreciate that, Kaiser, and it's been really great to get to know some of your work and read some of your essays and listen to your Sinica podcast, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. But just building on what you just shared with Tulin, I'm going to speak as someone who's certainly not an expert on China or Chinese related issues at all.
Neither am I. Just to be sure.
You're more expert than we are.
Well, putting it mildly,
we don't like the word expert. I certainly don't. I mean, it's just
learner,
preposterous. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
always learner.
Always a student, right? But it's very true. I mean, if you look at kind of dominant, or at least in my experience, if you look at kind of dominant discourses of, world powers, so to speak, and even in my kind of field and what a lot of this podcast is focused on, which is even visions around tech, developments around technology and the future, we often hear, well, it's either the American vision or the Chinese vision, right? And so it becomes this like, these are the two models for the world. And we know it's not nearly as simple as that. And we know here in the United States right now, we are encountering a heavy number of issues in terms of the attempt to protect our democracy, economic inequalities going mad, etc. But I want to just ask you, as we sort of look at the kind of almost stereotype, but, kind of top-down macro view of China, China is seen as this, superpower, the other superpower other than the United States, massive GDP, a trailblazer in technology. But what I find most incredible when I look at, Chinese modernity and, the last several decades of China is incredible advances in overcoming illiteracy and overcoming poverty. And so I guess I wanted to ask you about those sorts of visions and those understandings of China as well. Yes, an authoritarian state-driven country. Yes, many problematic aspects. Yes, surveillance, just like we have here, by the way, in a different way. But what about these sorts of incredible achievements that the Chinese government and state has made? I don't know if it's the Chinese government or China has made. And, where do you draw hope from as we look at sort of Chinese successes within China
Yeah.
and around the world? Yeah.
I think the main thing here is that, and I certainly agree with you that it's these accomplishments that really matter ultimately more than just, the gleaming towers of skyscrapers and all of the glittery stuff, the LED covered buildings and the drone swarms and stuff. No, of course, literacy, poverty alleviation, electrification, potable water, all of this stuff matters just a whole lot more. And, here the story does not begin, with 1979 and the launch of reform and opening under Deng Xiaoping. I mean, literacy and poverty alleviation and things like this, I mean, they really begin earlier, right? Even when we look at poverty, where, we talk about China having lifted so many out of poverty and how much of that has happened in the post-Mao period. But, if you set the bar at 1978, 79 and look back to 1949, you see pretty impressive progress there as well. So there has been this sort of tendency to downplay. I mean, we blur everything that happened between 1949 and 1976 when, Mao dies. We blur that somehow into like just two events, the famine of the Great Leap Forward and, of course, the Cultural Revolution. And that's not the entire truth of it. It takes a lot more, looking at. And when you look at something, especially something like literacy, that's where you really see the gigantic leaps. It continues to improve in the time since, obviously. But yeah, there are all different measures of human flourishing that we can look at. And there are very, very few of them where China's progress isn't really very, very commendable. So what I urge people to do is just, to complicate this, that this isn't just about the Communist Party getting out of the way and allowing, the entrepreneurial energies of the Chinese people to express themselves fully. That's not what it is. I mean, that's a part of it, obviously, but it's complicated. There's no easy way to explain, or even, to sort of look at all things that have happened. There's some things that China obviously has done right. I think land reform is one. I think that was a very, very important move early on. These omelets take the breaking of an awful lot of eggs, though, right? There's a lot of violence involved in something as far-reaching as land reform, and we can sit back and just reduce it to this idea. But the lived experience of land reform is very different depending on whether you were a landowner or a tenant farmer. The marriage law of 1951, I mean, very, very important. I think not too long ago, I read a really great book by one of my favorite writers, Peter Hessler, where he talks about the Egyptian Revolution. He spent some time, after living in China for a very, very long time. He's a New Yorker correspondent for China. He went to Egypt with his wife and their young family and lived there during, the Arab Spring uprising. And he kind of looks at Egypt reflected off of China. And the book is, much of the book is called The Buried in Archaeology of the Egyptian Revolution, is struck by the incompleteness of revolution in Egypt and how, tradition still has its hold. And that's probably nowhere more clearly expressed than in the role of women in the Egyptian economy and in Egyptian society. And you have to be sort of blown away at how far China has come, considering that it emerged from, basically not just arranged marriage, but basically, women as chattel and concubinage and foot binding and all of this, just within the life of some people still alive today. So yeah, lots of elements of progress to talk about. I mean, you could teach a year-long course and only just touch on this superficially.
It's remarkable that you brought up the Egyptian revolution, because I actually spent almost, 3 years, a month or two each year, living in Cairo, writing for Al Jazeera and writing about the Arab Spring. And a huge part of that revolution, what was stated in Arabic, bread, freedom, and social justice, but in that order.
Right.
And I think that's a key point that, about bread, the importance of meeting people's poverty alleviation needs and basic capacities so they can live and thrive as human beings. And that brought all sorts of people together: laborers, football fans, the Ikhwan, the Muslim Brotherhood, Salafiyas, who are pretty hardcore Islamists, secular folks, etc. And some sort of lefty revolutionary types who were quoting Trotsky, the unfinished revolution there. So that's such a huge part of social movements. So I appreciate that point a lot.
Yeah, and the people that it doesn't bring into the tent are the hardcore neoliberals, the people who simply believe that there's only one way to prioritize values, and that, let's invert Maslow's hierarchy of needs here, and let's start with self-actualization. Let's start with freedom of political expression. Let's start with civil and political liberties. And I think this is a thing that I think really cuts to the very heart of the whole China conundrum, is that I really believe I am neither some sort of ethical, absolutist, a universalist, nor kind of, slipped all the way down the slope kind of relativist either. Both of these things I find to be kind of an abhorrent idea. And, I think many of us are kind of looking for that sensible middle that says, no, not all ideas are equal, not all approaches are equal. But neither are there hard and fast absolutes that apply equally across all human societies. And so, I've come up with this idea. It's not entirely original. I've seen iterations of it elsewhere, but only after I started really thinking about it and looking for other people who had thought the same thing. I call it priority pluralism. And it's really this idea, as you've just touched on, land, you said bread. What were they? Bread,
freedom, and social justice. But freedom here in a very, very simple way, like not.
Sure. But, putting bread first is right. Bread, I'd say, housing and clothing, obviously. But I think that while all societies these days, while modern societies, they broadly subscribe to as ideals, not just political and civil rights, but also basic economic rights. But different societies prioritize these things very differently. And I think it's bizarre to me how Americans are so stubborn in this idea that there's only one correct way to order them. Now, we recognize pluralism domestically. We recognize that within our own society, even at the most fundamental level, the metaphysical, the epistemic level, religion itself, we have this marvelous, clause in our Constitution, the Establishment Clause, that it basically establishes a separation of church and state. We can't have a state religion, and we at some point, I think at some level, we all sort of accept the validity of other confessional claims in America. But we can't extend that beyond the border to the very simple idea that maybe economic justice could come before, civil and political liberties in other historical and in other contexts. It's not such a hard leap to make. And I think that makes all the difference, basically, in how people think about China.
Super important point there, Kaiser, because literally what I was sort of witnessing in various revolutionary contexts that I've done fieldwork in is what the United States tends to do is a lot of finger wagging and moralizing, including around technology. Our technologies are the reason why you were able to liberate yourself. That's what they were essentially saying in the context of the Arab Spring and in Egypt. And instead, it's our sort of neoliberal values, whatever that means, are what you all should follow, even though people in the Arab world and I was in part of some of these protests, were having tear gas shot at them, manufactured in the United States, right? So the kind of like hypocrisy People are not dumb in this world. They're like, you guys are telling us that we should aspire to be American-like, whatever that means. And in the meantime, you guys are selling armaments that are being used to harm and threaten and commit violence against us.
And Ramesh, if anyone doubts what you're saying, just remember how we just so happily, our media appended the names of particular American tech products to each of the color revolutions and Arab Spring uprisings. And, there's one that I recall that sort of sits in between a color revolution that had the name of color green and an Arab Spring uprising because it took place 2 years before that started. But in Tehran in '09, after Ahmadinejad's reelection, what did we call that? We called that the YouTube revolution, right? Before that, we had, a Twitter revolution in Moldova. We keep doing this. I mean, Tahrir Square, where you were, that got a couple of names, but, Facebook and Google, right? You could call it either. It was interchangeable, but clearly these were, all about American technologies and all about our emancipatory narrative, right?
And which was the opposite of reality. I empirically invalidated that. I mean, almost no one had access to these technologies. People who did have access to them were demographically homogenous. They were often in a bubble writing these things. And then what I started to realize was that many of my activist friends started manipulating and appropriating these platforms to influence older media cycles, satellite television, domestic media, radio, the things that actually reached people and that people working and middle class people, which is the vast majority of the Egyptian population at that time, what they actually trusted. They didn't trust American tech, nor should they then or now.
Right, absolutely.
Back over to you, Tulin.
Yeah, I kind of want to hone in a little bit more on these kind of quality of life issues and these economic rights that you're talking about. As someone who went to Beijing for the first time this summer, as someone who is more on the progressive left of the political spectrum, who kind of looks at America and even California as an example of where a lot of infrastructure projects have failed. We still haven't gone high-speed rail. I'm living in LA where it's very difficult to travel around without a car, and spending the summer in Beijing where it's such a huge city, and yes, it can take 45 minutes to get from one end to the other end on metro, but at least there is that opportunity.
And
Whereas
it costs you like $3
exactly,
or
not
less,
even,
right?
not
Right.
even, maybe like
Yeah,
30
yeah, yeah,
cents.
yeah. Right.
And there's so many just ways of getting around the city, whether that's the shared bike programs that are just so much more robust than we have in the States, the metros, the buses, Didi, the rideshare program that is really convenient. All of that having been built out in the last few decades, where America still feels like we're in this kind of standstill, where we had a period in the 60s of rapid urban development and investment in infrastructure projects, but it seems like, you know, bureaucracy is getting in the way. And you had on Dan Wong, the author of Breakneck, who talks a lot about kind of the outcomes of what he calls the lawyerly society in the US and the engineering state in China. But he has also recently kind of argued that China and America are more similar than they are different in some ways. And I'm wondering, as someone maybe on the progressive left who might be more naive and looking towards, China as an example of infrastructure development, successful infrastructure development, you've brought up kind of there are costs to that as well. But are there places where maybe China and America are more similar in that way, where we can create more understanding between the two countries to create better outcomes for both?
Yeah, the progressive left has a lot of trouble kind of getting its head around China. I mean, for so many reasons, because in so many ways, and Dan Wong talks a little bit about this. He doesn't really explore it in great depth, but China can look like an awfully reactionary, quite regressive state. The progressive left is known for its fondness for, all-pervasive surveillance, for authoritarian controls. The Chinese society can still, when you look closely at it, it's awfully patriarchal still, right? There are a lot of things about it that you're not going to find. It's got a strong nativist, even an ethno-nationalist streak to it. So a lot of things. On the other hand, some of the outcomes that it looks at, that it openly admires. So I would caution anyone who is of the left to don't be too quick to throw your values out the window and embrace all things China. These are very, very different societies. Things don't you can't just simply transpose things into the key of America straight out of China and expect that they're going to be melodious. It's just really not going to happen. So careful. I think, look, there are a lot of these things are contingent. They were because China didn't have legacy systems in place before. They didn't have to tear out the old to install the new. We've seen the leapfrog thing happen so many times. When I arrived in China in the 80s, it was really hard to get a landline installed in your house. It took months of waiting, and it was extraordinarily expensive. Landlines never really became a huge thing. It wasn't like everyone had a landline in their house before cell phones came along. So cell phones, spread very, very quickly. So with many, many other technologies, automobile ownership was very, very low in China prior to the advent of EVs, and so EVs have been able to sort of had an easier time with uptake. There weren't as many gas stations that would need to be retrofitted to become EV charging stations and things like that. I mean, there's a lot of path dependency in America. There's a lot of inertia that would need to be overcome. So it's not, again, you can't just sort of cut and paste a solution. But the things, that China has gotten right, I think they've some of them have gotten very right. And whenever I hear somebody talk about the marvelous sort of frictionless transportation that's available to us in Beijing, I always remember that this is why I don't buy a car. This is why lots of people don't buy a car, and a car is a very, very big piece of consumption. So when I hear Americans finger wag about China's lack of consumption and how the C component of GDP calculation should be much, much higher, I have to wonder, where is China's investment in excellent subway stations like you were just talking about? Where is the private sector investment in affordable ride sharing and bike sharing and all the other things that make getting from A to B really, really easy in China? Where do those factor in, right? So I know I'm getting a little bit away from where the progressive left ought to be thinking about it, but there are other things that the left should be anchored as it is in America in concern for working Americans. When they turn their eyes to China, they should be thinking about the working class Chinese, and it's not always such a pretty picture there, right? I mean, it's much better. I don't believe in the kind of old horrible sweatshop narrative. I think there has been a lot of improvement in the lives of working Chinese, but by no means is it some sort of, well, to use the name of your show, it's a socialist utopia. It's not. We should be careful about our assessments.
Certainly not, and I think but it is very notable. Now we're recording this just a week or so after we saw someone like Zoran Mamdani get elected in New York, which personally I'm very, very happy about, and I think a lot of my friends are, around a platform of affordability. Kind of a reframe, but an economic reframe from sort of investments of the state in people's lives. Instead, it's sort of like, hey, you guys can't afford to live. And in that sense, I think there's something very resonant with successes in China where so many people have become more economically secure. And as you and Tulin just discussed, there are major investments in infrastructure and public services and public goods. And that can occur while still being in a society that quells free speech and persecutes certain minorities. Because here in the United States, we're having affordability crises, absences of public investment, and now attacks on free speech by the state. So this is all to say that the legacies and the impacts ideologically and materially both the United States on a global level, but China also are profound and yet quite different. I do want to ask you though about legacies of Mao, because here's an interesting thing. I was looking at old social movements, 60s and 70s, for a paper I was writing, looking at examples like the Black Panthers and other groups who commonly quoted Mao and actually distributed writings by Chairman Mao to their enrolled members. I was in Bolivia about 10 years ago doing field work, and I met the head of, who knows if it was just window dressing, but I basically met the head of their version of the Federal Reserve, their minister of Treasury. I was trying to interview Evo Morales at that time, partly journalistically. They kept talking about Maoism. I'm just wondering how much of this is a smokescreen. What is Mao? Does Mao and those sorts of, that legacy, does that live today in the Chinese state? Is that at all consistent with Xi Jinping and One Belt, One Road and all these new kind of modern visions coming out of China?
So I think the role that Mao plays in society today is extremely, it's a strange mix. There's a lot of just plain old pragmatism. It's recognized that you can't de-Stalinize the way that you did in the Soviet Union, that he's a load-bearing wall you can't just simply knock out because the edifice collapses. There's a recognition of that. And there were a lot of things that he did that the present Chinese state benefits from enormously. One is, mostly unifying the territory of China, and expelling, the forces of colonialism. There were a lot of things that they still are very appreciative of. He did confer on China a very strong sense of national pride and dignity. You can't take that away from him. Nobody is unaware of his, his less, let's say, less unambiguously good legacy, right? He murdered a lot of people. A lot of people died from policies that he pursued that were not well thought through. It was, I don't know what numbers you believe in terms of the number of people who died during the Great Famine of 1959 through 60, 58 through 60, really. But there's a very mixed record of the guy. They're pragmatic about it. I think for the most part, they use him, they invoke his legacy where it's necessary. But I think that's a more realistic way to look at people, right? Why either make him an icon of all that is perfect, or vilify him completely, because he was certainly worthy of a lot of praise and a lot of criticism. The common kind of proportion that's assigned is 70% good, 30% wrong. I think probably most people would invert that when they think about him, but that 30% is still pretty substantial, and it matters to them. Look, is Xi Mao? No, that's absurd. I think there's this idea, this incorrect idea of what Mao was all about and what the Cultural Revolution was all about. The idea that, the Cultural Revolution represented, the triumph of totalistic, governmental control is completely wrong, right? This was not what it was. It was quite the inverse of that, which was the collapse of party authority. It was, Mao using his personal charisma to mobilize young people, these Red Guards and others, to attack the foundations of political authority in China, and not just the party authority, but authority wherever it was, in the school, in the workplace, in the hospital, in all institutions. And so it's very different. It was, people think of it in China not in terms of totalitarianism, but in terms of chaos. And I think that's a much more accurate understanding of what he represented. So in a way, I think that Xi is not certainly not repeating a cultural revolution in any way, shape, or form, but you couldn't necessarily say the same about a certain other leader of a large continental-sized major power. where, he is attacking pillars of authority, and, he is, there is a strong anti-intellectual, anti-expert streak, where he does thrive on chaos, where he almost literally has screamed out, bombard the establishment, the headquarters, right?
Yeah, there's certainly, I know you've mentioned this in your podcast, but those memes going around where America is in their late Qing era.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And decorate and doing a whole revamp of the White House. But I want to
Right.
move a little bit away from this and back onto you, Kaiser, and your story around how you got started with Sinica, both from a personal standpoint, carving out this more unique path, even before the podcast sphere has become, now it's such a fad, but you've been doing it for 15 years before it's been like seen as a trendy thing. So where did you get this interest in bringing more light and less heat to what's happening on the ground in China?
Yeah, I mean, it started off in 2010. I think, again, this touches on technology, because we all had our, iPhone 2s at that point. The podcast app finally sort of showed up. Prior to that, you had to sideload podcasts onto your, I mean, the network speeds were just so slow in the 3G era, where, it just made more sense to sideload. But as we started to see better network speeds and the availability of the podcast app directly on, so you could subscribe to, you could, have the RSS feed, send a podcast directly to your phone. That changed everything. And it was in the context of a conversation around that, that Jeremy Goldkorn and I said, what are your favorite podcasts? What are you listening to? And he's, like, oh, 99% Invisible and this and that. And I said, oh, yeah, me, I'm pretty old school. It's still Radiolab and This American Life. And, and then one of us, neither of us can remember who, just said, why don't we do one? I mean, we both recognized right away that it made sense. We're both talkers. We both are, very gregarious people who know a lot of people. And we immediately just sort of understood that we would be able to do this successfully, that there was just so much to talk about, that there would be so many people. And Jeremy came up with a brilliant idea of working with a guy who already had a podcast studio that he was using to do Chinese language instruction. It was called Pop-Up Chinese. And we had a quick chat with him, and he said, oh yeah, no, I'll edit and produce you guys. All you need to do is just come in ready to record. You bring a guest in, and I'll do all the editing and publishing. No exchange of considerations involved. We knew that, his audience, because they're interested in learning Chinese, would be sort of a ready-made audience, because they would probably be also interested in learning something about contemporary China. And at the same time, we knew that we would bring in, potential customers for him. So yeah, it was a very, very happy marriage that lasted for the whole 6 years before the podcast was acquired, actually. So I was working at a big Chinese tech company, Baidu. Jeremy had sold his old startup, Danwei, and we both were, we were open to the idea of being able to quit our day jobs if we could just podcast for a living, turn this little passion project into an actual means of earning a living. And almost like we willed this into existence, along came a wealthy investor who had started up a China newsletter, but had everything, the money, had some tech people, but did not have China expertise. Didn't have people who would be able to actually write and edit the thing, and didn't have a brand recognition thing. So she just offered to basically acqui-hire Jeremy and me. And we rode that gravy train for 7 years. It was a beautiful thing. After that, it collapsed in November of 23. And I gave Jeremy kind of a decent interval we had to sit Shiva over the corpse of the thing for a little while. I had the IP to Sinica. I could still walk off with it. I wanted Jeremy to come along, but he was pretty China burnt out at that point. And he just really, after waiting a few months and just pestering him, saying, are you in or out? Are you in or out? He finally said, yeah, I can't do it now. So I took it on my own, built a Substack for it, and recreated a lot of the old company under just sort of one person's work. And yeah, so here we are today, still going strong.
You're carrying the torch forward. Um, I guess over these last 15 years, you've built up you and Jeremy, now you doing it solo, have built up such a profound and prolific body of work. And you guys have recently been talking a little bit more on this vibe shift going on perspectives on China. And I guess like from your 15 years of experience tracking the ups and downs, I guess where do you think this vibe shift is going? And kind of a follow-up, do you think that I mean, for me, learning Chinese has been something I've been doing since I was a kid, but grasping language fluency is so difficult, and even it works very well when I was in China and I can be in that fluent environment and pick up on things and have conversations with other Beida students on what's going on with them, what's on the ground, what are they thinking about. But now that I'm back in America, it's like I can see the language fluency just slipping through my fingers. Since Chinese is such a difficult language to learn, do you think language becomes a barrier in the ability to fully collaborate and reach like a certain level of a vibe shift, or is that not a central issue at all?
Yeah, language is very important. And while barriers are coming down, I mean, nowadays it's really easy. You can just sort of grab stuff off of Chinese websites and run it through an LLM, and you get a pretty darn good translation of it. So it's encouraged me to be really lazy. I don't take the hours it would take me to read a Qiushi article in original Chinese. Now I'll just run it through an LLM and read it in 10 minutes, which is, I think it's good. I'm going to use tech in that way. Well, I think the more important thing though is that sort of I'm a very big believer in country feel and the importance of that. I think it's really important to be in steady contact with people, communicating with them in their native language about what's on their mind. Again, technology offers us some help on that front. I mean, I like to do video calls with my friends in China often and just sort of, hey, what's your vibe? What are you feeling? What's on your mind? Let's talk about this latest scandal that just broke. Let's talk about this. How are you looking at America right now? What does the trade war look like from you? And talk to people in different walks of life. I'm sure that you made a lot of friends while you were there, and I'm sure that you've got a lot of WeChat things. I think that people would probably be very, very happy to jump on a video call with you of a morning and tell you what's up. And that's what I did for the time that I was away, especially during the pandemic. And it really, I think, helped me to connect with what it felt like to be there on the ground during that time. As far as the vibe shift thing goes, look, I mean, we started the show back in 2010 during what we already recognized was a downward vibe shift. It was sliding into what it then became. And, me, an unflappable optimist, I was just in real mental anguish by, 13, 14 years into that. And I think this turnaround, this improvement has been just very life affirming for me. It's the first one that I've seen, the first time I can genuinely feel kind of optimistic about the direction things are heading. And unfortunately, so much of it is because, it's such a shit show in America right now. That's the problem. I mean, if it weren't the case, if it were just sort of arrived at without that kind of comparative angle, I'd be even happier. But hey, I'll take it, because anything that decreases the odds of actual conflagration is good in my book.
Here, here, yeah. Ramesh.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. One thing I wanted to ask you about, Kaiser, is something I think we're sitting through even within the United States. So we are all engulfed. Our lives are so mediated by these digital technologies, social media technologies, internet technologies, video chatting technologies, increasingly now these generative AI systems. Yet I feel both within the United States and certainly on a global level, and I'm going to kind of move toward China in a moment with this question, we are not actually, I feel, really increasing our understanding of one another. I mean, to put it mildly, in the US, we see polarization highly correlated with the directions that big tech has taken. So we're not even understanding ourselves within this country. But I think that issue expands in its importance when we think globally. So I want to ask you about how incredibly misunderstood I feel, or poorly understood, Chinese people are, youth cultures are, and Chinese technologies are. So I'll give you just an example. I'm of Indian descent. India and China are neighbors. They have, off and on tough relationships with one another. Let's put it that way. The author Pankaj Mishra is an influence on me. He's really bright.
He's a friend of mine. Yeah.
Oh, that's
Yeah.
cool. Well, we
Yeah.
got to get him on, and we'll ask you. We'll
Yeah,
bug you.
I adore him.
He's wonderful, wonderful
just
work.
finished After Gaza pretty
Yes.
recently, and I don't know if you've read his most recent novel, which is called Run and Hide. It's absolutely great. I highly recommend it. Yeah.
Oh wow! Because I read his work for many years, and we met him on campus recently. And Pankaj makes the point that they're neighbors, but there's such little understanding between these populations of one another, meaning China and India. We've heard incredible, obviously, totally racist positions around China circulate around the world, and of course in the United States, and in the literally from the president of the United States during the pandemic, and of course that's part of his dog,
and now on India as well. I mean,
as well, big time.
Really big time, right?
Absolutely, people don't know how incredibly agile and intelligently designed a technology like WeChat, created by Tencent, actually is. People think that the DeepSeek Chinese AI revelations were Chinese people stealing stuff. Right. You keep hearing that too. China's full of piracy. Well, everybody's doing piracy with everybody else, and all of us have piracy. Being American citizens, have piracy
in our DNA. Yeah,
and attacking us by big tech companies and the state.
Right.
So, yes, I would just want to ask you about what is creating these kind of ongoing, I would say, profound misunderstandings of one another, particularly of China and Chinese people and Chinese technologies, because here's a country that has a footprint with the New Silk Road Initiative all around the world, yet is, I think, very misunderstood and actually the subject of many, I would say, racist stereotypes.
So I would preface this by saying that it's not just the world that misunderstands or fails to understand China. China is equally to blame for a lot of this. I mean, and especially when it comes to India, there is such a pathetic absence of even the most rudimentary curiosity about its colossal neighbor to the southwest. I mean, there's very, very little interest, and there's an awful lot of racism directed against Indians from China. Just the worst sorts of stereotypes that you hear about.
And vice versa. And vice
versa. But at least there's interest in knowing something, even if there's. Look, I mean, I've heard it said, and I think it's kind of true, that it's sort of the national pastime of the Indian intellectual to obsess about China. That makes some sense to me. I mean, they see, hey, look, 47 and 49 were not far apart. Where were we then? We were, in many measures of human flourishing, better off than China. Then what happened in the intervening time? Why hasn't India been? And there's a lot of soul searching that's been provoked by China. No soul searching provoked in China by India. I'd like to see more of that. But yeah, I mean, that's another issue for another time. But I think that you put your finger on some of the big problems. Look, there's a real kind of a paradox of connectivity when you are more connected with somebody. It's the old familiarity breeds contempt. I remember in the decade of the 2000s, as we came up toward the Olympics, you had a confluence of factors where suddenly a lot of Westerners were very interested in China. It was, China's big coming out party. And there was so there was a lot of interest in China that hadn't been a focus of any attention for the previous 6-7 years, because, after September 11th, there was nothing to think about except for, the global war on terror. So China sort of faded from anyone's attention. But as the Olympics approached, there was a lot of attention. And at that moment, there were a lot of Chinese people who not only were starting to use the internet in really significant numbers. I mean, there was less than 1 million by the end of '99, but by the Olympics, there were hundreds of millions of people online in China using, high-speed internet. Now, this was also a generation that had been the first to be taught English as a mandatory subject. Now, not all of them could speak with fluency, but they knew enough to be able to read comments sections in YouTube videos or in, Guardian posts and things like that. They were interested in hearing what the West had to say about China, because now they were talking about it a lot and paying attention, and they were able to read it, and they were able to talk back. And so we saw by 2007, 2008, and 2009, the first large-scale, unintermediated encounter between ordinary Chinese and ordinary Westerners. And guess what? They didn't like each other. All they did was argue. Everyone thought that they were misunderstood. I mean, there were, it was. I used to talk about it as the war between the Red Guards and the Rednecks. I mean, it was just such idiocy on both sides. I feel a little, maybe more inclined to be sympathetic with the Chinese, who were very, very put upon. They had the worst sorts of idiotic remarks being said about them. And so I understand the chip on their shoulder as a result of that. Now, I mean, fast forward a few years and we have social media, where you have basically not just that dynamic, but you have it combined with the fact that, social media has this built-in perverse reward mechanism for stridency, right? For you use activating emotion, you use language that's going to piss people off, get them outraged, get them, you find out really, really quickly once you start posting on Twitter that my balanced and sensible post that tells both sides. First of all, you don't have room for it, but insofar as you do, it will get no kind of traction, right? But if you write something really snarky and kind of mean and just cutting and vicious, it's going to get a lot of traction. So when you come back 20 minutes later, as we all do, to see how many likes or retweets it's gotten, you get that little shot of dopamine from the mean shit you say, and not from the reasonable, balanced stuff that you say. So it starts. It works in our damn neural pathways. It rewards us for stridency and for just, being assholes, basically. And so, yeah, I mean, so naturally that's what happens. And then we are where we are today. I mean, insanely polarized. And I start thinking about, my God, maybe the Chinese had something right about like this whole business of censorship. Or no, I'm joking. I mean, but We're in a pickle today, that's for sure. I mean, it's not a good thing, and I don't see a way out of it.
And one thing also with that, just really quick, Kaiser, is it's one thing to not support censorship, but it's another to legitimate the most extreme forms of speech being those which count.
Right.
Online, what's visible is usually what's computationally set up to go viral, and what's computationally set up to go viral is this kind of outrage garbage. Right. So that's actually means that, per Animal Farm, all speech, I'm kind of riffing on it, or the Orwellian, the great George Orwell book, all of us are equal, but some of us are more equal than others. We can say the same thing about speech on these digital platforms.
That's absolutely right. And when it comes to China and other things, it's like we have to reckon with this, like, with the advent of 24-hour satellite news and with social media, now all of us, every day, we sit there and we are sort of asked to pass moral judgment on all these issues that we would, 20 years ago never have. Nobody would have heard of the Rohingya. Nobody would have heard. I mean, or about the Yazidis when they were, or all these other persecuted people. But now we have this moral docket that's filled constantly. We always have to, take a stand, express our outrage, do the thing. And it's really, really easy now to weaponize that kind of outrage. And, we saw that happen with respect to China. And the real tragedy here is that there often is something that we, ought to really be outraged about. But it's so easy to see how the other side, in this case China, would recognize something like, the whole discourse on the Uyghur so-called genocide as a weaponized form of discourse. Like that, this is all out of proportion to what's really happening here. Even people who don't like what's happening recognize that it's mostly being used as a cudgel to bludgeon China with. It's not actual, heartfelt, honest concern for people who are having, their rights really stepped on.
Yeah, completely. And I think as someone from a younger generation who grew up with this constant stream of information from the minute I've been in like middle school through social media, where you're constantly being exposed to all of these different things, it can be overwhelming to the point of whether or not you're being molded by the extremism, or most people are. You're at least in this like information paralysis at times, where you don't even know where to start. Um,
That's right.
but I also think what's interesting is there, I kind of got onto Red Note, 小红书, like when there was that whole, when there was a whole shift,
TikTok
like
migrant thing.
TikTok
Yeah, yeah.
migrate thing. And through that, there was definitely, I noticed a lot of influencers who were either full Chinese or they're halvesies like me or 混血儿, like talking about their experiences. Being in China as someone who is of multi-ethnic origins and having these conversations around like what is it like in the US versus China, or what is it like in China versus Italy, and how are we bridging these cultural connections. And I think while social media has definitely been very divisive, it's interesting to see through these like entertainment medias maybe an embracing of multiculturalism in some aspects of Chinese culture. So I wanted to ask you a bit more about that in this kind of evolving Chinese identity. As someone who is half Chinese and half Turkish is my other half. I've always held both of those identities pretty equally and have embraced this aspect of multiculturalism. But I think there's often a narrative about China where it's this like hegemon, like cultural hegemon. Everyone's the same. I mean, it's mostly Han Chinese, but there are over 50 different ethnicities. And I used to do Chinese classical dance as a kid, and I was doing ethnic dances of like the Miao people, Xinjiang dances, um, Yi dances, like all of these different cultural ethnic groups. But it seems to me like maybe there is a shift towards embracing this multiculturalism. There's this huge exhibit at the Beijing Arts and Crafts Museum that is of like this huge sculpture of all these 50 different ethnicities right in the entrance. And the whole museum is just the art from these different ethnicities being embraced. Or like on the CCTV Chinese New Year celebrations, there is this push to embrace the multi-ethnic part of China. So I'm curious to see if you sense an evolving Chinese identity. Has this always been the case and people just haven't been talking about it? Um, and is there this difference between maybe the nativist ethno-nationalism political side of the one China aspect, and then also this holding and embracing of multiculturalism?
Yeah, I mean, I think I have a lot of um, I'm sort of very, very torn on this. On the one hand, look, I have an incredible amount of sympathy for you know people of these ethnicities who very understandably feel like they're just being exoticized, that they're reduced to this sort of like Disneyland caricature. It's like, if you went to a Native American reservation and you sort of wanted everyone to put on a show where they put their feather headdresses on and danced a war dance for you. I mean, it's really, really patronizing from what they see. And when there are these displays on national television, or when it's, they just become devalued as just one among a bunch of other non-Han ethnic groups. That's totally understandable. I mean, I'm sure you can see what that would feel like, right? On the other hand, sometimes that guy who is probably some kind of racist, when he says, I have a lot of respect for my black friends, or I have a lot of black friends, or I really love Mexican food. I mean, they kind of, in a weird way, mean it earnestly, and you want to sort of give them a little bit of credit for even being a little bit open-minded. I mean, that's sort of where we are right now with China. There's no question to me that there's halting progress being made, but it's halting, and it comes in of an embarrassing form so much of the time. I have trouble with this. I mean, look, I would not want to be an ethnic minority in China. I mean, I don't think that it would be a comfortable thing to be. I was in Yunnan recently, in a place where in an area where there's an ethnic minority that's the dominant group there, and they're called the Bai, and the main form of revenue, as far as I can tell, of tourism is from Han Chinese women from big cities who go there and they put on the ethnic costume and stand by some picturesque little stone bridge or against a sort of ethnic-y looking backdrop and have their picture taken. I mean, I'm trying to imagine what that would look like in the United States. If, it's like, I'm going to go to this, historic black ghetto and I'm going to put on like a 30s zoot suit, or I'm going to go to the Indian reservation and put on a feather war bonnet and, hold a tomahawk up and go, wah, 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 wah. I mean, it's just like, yeah, we're not there yet. That's the upshot of it. Yeah, I'd love to see that, more progress toward it, but it's slow in coming.
Yeah, and it's difficult with the demographics being so like 90, I
That's
don't
right.
know, it's not over 90%, huh?
Yeah, like 92% Han,
Exactly.
right? And Han itself is a weird thing. I mean, I'm Han, and so are, people from Canton, and we have very, very different, we speak different languages and have different physiologies. Just, we look different, right? I mean, there's no way that it's a meaningful word anymore, right? It's a weird thing.
Yeah, there's a lot of, I guess, the history reflects this, but a lot of the history, the language, the cultural traditions, they reflect the differences across the spectrum. I mean, I remember learning about it when I was in at Peking University over the summer in a more like memeified, lighthearted way of like what different regions are known for, but it comes through in more serious ways for sure. But I think it's
Yeah,
true
yeah,
in that, I mean, America holds this tension between nationalism and multiculturalism in one way. There's efforts at, embracing diversity, and also clamping down on what that is, while also taking into question like who's considered a true American, and it's becoming even more the question today.
right, right. Well, I mean, the other side of this is that people who out for usually motivated by very good intentions, who take up the cause of Tibetans or Uyghurs, or they need to stop and they need to ask themselves, are you saying that what the China that you want is a pure Han Chinese ethno state? Are you willing to give up on at least this misguided, but it's still well-intentioned idea to create a multi-ethnic state out of the remnants of the Qing Empire, right? I mean, that's what China's trying to do. It's like, do we really want to condemn that project, which is effectively what we often do certainly when we do things like call for independence, or when we call for total cultural autonomy, when we oppose any form of assimilation, even the sort of voluntary type. It's a real conundrum, and I think this is one of the big questions that China is going to be wrestling with in years to come.
It's a huge question. And I think the main distinctions also, we look at a country like the United States, is, our population here in the United States, you're Chinese American, I'm Indian American, Tulin's Turkish Chinese American, or Chinese Turkish American, whatever order. This is a country all immigrants because of a genocide that was conducted against the indigenous peoples of this country, right? So as a result, there's always this question of what's the true native identity of this country, when actually it's Native Americans and indigenous peoples who themselves are not a monolithic identity
Right.
in and of themselves. So I want to, yeah. So these are pearls of wisdom, and we're really enjoying this conversation. I want to ask you one question about, I know you're an artist and a musician as well, involved in music, in China, and of course, I'm sure in the United States as well, and other parts of the world as well. Many of our our being like me, I'll describe myself as sort of kind of naive, open-minded person, but naive in the sense that I don't know a lot about certain cultures or even about China deeply. I've been in China once for 3 weeks. That's it. And don't speak Chinese, etc. And I learned very quickly how incredibly diverse that nation is. So, a lot of my main connection to Chinese arts and artists are people like Ai Weiwei. But Ai Weiwei, much love for his work. I know exactly. It was very much got framed in this kind of Chinese critic direction, right? That a lot of people are quick to take the mantle. Oh, Chinese is so terrible, so awful to its own people. We like Ai Weiwei. And I'm just saying that like as a sort of naive liberal American, Indian American in a way. But of course, there's so much going on in arts and music and all of it within China itself. So, forget about Ai Weiwei unless you want to comment on that. But I want to actually ask you about rock bands, producing music in China, the creative landscape in China, both within China itself as well as, if appropriate, in the Chinese diaspora.
Yeah.
Speak to us about that,
it's
because that's not known globally.
Yeah, I think it's a really good segue into this. I mean, talking about somebody like Ai Weiwei, because he really represents a whole, and sort of the awareness of him in the Western world. It represents one of the big pathologies when it comes to. I mean, and you've just been very candid about admitting this on it's a bit part of a bigger problem where when we look at China, we would think that to understand a country, we should understand its intellectuals, we should understand its artists, we should understand the people who produce the humanities of that country. The ones that we are aware of, the critical and dissident intellectuals and the critical artists are hugely overrepresented in what we know. We don't know who the artists that ordinary Chinese people are. We don't know the intellectuals that are the ones who are what we like to say the David Brooks of China, right? This sort of middle of the road kind of more establishment intellectual. They're not sexy enough for Western consumption, right? They're going to be talking about issues that don't concern us directly. So yeah, it's a real problem. When it comes to the arts, when it comes to things that I know, I'm pretty pessimistic right now. I think China is not in a good place with a lot of this stuff. With art, I think that we went through a long period, and I think it's still not even over yet, where we saw this kind of triumph of style over substance, where you have a lot of this cynical catering to what they believe Western art markets want. This popular style called cynical realism. I mean, it was probably most clearly. Look, I've literally sat in rooms of artists all smoking various substances and talking about how we're going to scam Whitey, how they're going, and all talking only semi-jokingly about how all you need to do is take some Cultural Revolution era iconography, slap some sort of fast food labels onto it, stamp it all over with Coca-Cola or, with KFC or McDonald's, and white people somehow think that that's clever, and this is like Chinese pop art, and I'm going to spend a ton of money buying this. So they do that. There's a lot of cynical realism that's sold really well. It's just really horrible. I mean, a lot of it is just really truly bad. I even came up with my own word for that kind of cultural revolution. Iconography meets fast food. I called it mixed struggle. The mixed struggle art that was sold for so very long. And it's still out there. It's still kind of persistent. I think that's really kind of a sad thing. And so too with music. I mean, in the 80s and especially in the 90s and the early 2000s, they recognized that the people who are going to buy drinks at the bar and pay money to actually see, and not try to get in because they know a guy, are going to be the white people, the foreigners, the expatriates. And the easiest way to make them buzz and talk is to play music that is sort of for them, to play into certain stereotypes. I'm going to be an anti-authoritarian punker, right? I'm going to play punk, and I'm gonna, play my idiotic three chords and, and sing in this sort of brash major key and not actually, say anything except just what I think that they want to hear. Just this anti-authoritarian, anti-government message, and a lot of them sort of rode on that bullshit, and a lot of them played into that, and I think a lot of them still do. Again, this sort of triumph of style over substance. These guys who, it's like, I've got a cool haircut and an ironic T-shirt, and I sit and look at my shoes the whole time while I'm playing, and my guitar's not actually in tune, but hey, they don't care, they don't mind, and it's this Emperor's New Clothes thing. They think it's supposed to be cool because it's transgressive. I hate that. I really hate that. I want people to actually, exhibit a little bit of goddamn musicality in what they do, to actually put some effort into making music and into producing music, into recording music that sounds good, with lyrics that are meaningful and enduring and universal, that, actually leans into the good things about Chinese culture and makes use of those. So that's what I've tried to do in the bands that I've played in. Not that I'm some sort of, virtuosic musician or anything, but I think you should put some effort into it. There's too much of this nonsense.
Amen to that. Tulin, I'm going to hand over to you to close our conversation
Great.
this morning.
Kaiser, thank you so much for chatting with us about a whole spectrum of things. I want to ask you kind of a final, more forward-thinking question. You have kids who are Gen Z around my age.
Yeah.
What do you think they wish to see happen for the future? Whether that's for US-China relations, for China, kind of what's the path you hope that this generation will continue to forge? Our version of kind of what is your utopia question?
Yeah. I think that they're both, both my children are cognizant of being bicultural. I think that they are in different measure. My daughter, who came over when she's a little bit older, she came to the States when she was 12. She never lost any of her Chinese. In fact, it continued to improve because she continued to, consume a lot of content from China, and was really very in touch with what was happening in Chinese popular culture the whole time. And so she hasn't really missed a beat. When she goes back, she fits right in, and feels very, very able to swim in both societies really well. And I think that's what she wants. I think that she, and not just those two, she speaks very good Japanese and she's learning Korean. And so she has a very cosmopolitan outlook and wants a world in which that is an acceptable mode of being, where she doesn't need to actually pledge allegiance to any one state. And in that regard, she's very much like me. My son, it's not his fault. He came over when he was younger. He was 10, and felt a lot of social pressure to Americanize, and very much did so. He's now, though, learning Chinese. He's very into it. My wife, who doesn't really speak English, has been delighted that he's now texting her all the time in Chinese, and so I think he's really starting to wake up to how important China is in the world, and what an advantage his own Chineseness, his own familiarity with that culture is going to be for him. And he's still young. Boys blossom later. I know I didn't for a long time, but I think as he comes into his intellectual maturity, with China being such a big fixture in his life, I think he will also kind of come to appreciate just the leg up in that kind of, for many people, is just sort of a merely aspirational cosmopolitanism. He can sort of embody it with less effort, and I think he'll come to very much appreciate that. So I think the world they want to live in is one in which that is sort of multipolar but also low conflict, where I hope that they find years of their life that they can spend living in Africa, living in Europe, living in other parts of the world, and just sort of absorbing from all over the place. I really wish I had lived in a world like that, where I could have lived long stretches of my life in all sorts of different geographies. I'd love to have lived in India. I'd love to have lived in Central Asia. I'd love to have lived in Europe. Instead, I've spent 23 years of my life living in China and the rest of it in the States. That's fine. I'll take it, but I hope that they get even more of the world to sort of get under their, just get it under their fingers.
We have those wishes for all of us, including all three of us, Kaiser, including all our friends, including all our children or our friends' children, to have that greater global consciousness of really understanding the beauty of this planet for what it is. The planet being all its inhabitants, humans and non-humans. That's
absolutely
really the core of what our podcast is all about. And you just brought so much insight and stimulation to both of us in this conversation, Kaiser. This will be the first of many. I hope we can invite you back on soon, and just our deepest appreciation for joining us on Utopias today.
Thank you, Ramesh, and thank you so much, Tulin, both of you.
Hi, everybody. Your support means the world to us. Our podcast is really focused on creativity, on care, on stories of inspiration, and inspiring characters of all kinds. It's such a wonderful, wonderful way to reach community. This is a labor of love. So the real way we can sustain ourselves is through all of your support. Please rate, ideally 5 stars. Please share this with anyone and everyone you know. And feel free to reach out to us also with suggestions on guests. Reach us at podcastutopias@gmail.com. Thank you, everybody, for your support.